Are you walking through the dark tunnel? When everything collapses around you, you might feel completely alone. But God has not forgotten you today. Your darkest hour is where He begins. Let this story restore your broken faith. Are you walking through the dark tunnel right now? When everything collapses around you and you feel completely alone in the freezing cold, it is easy to believe that your life is over. My name is Ethan, and 10 years ago I reached a point where I believed God had turned His back on me forever. If you had seen my life 15 years ago, you would have thought I had everything a man could ever dream of. I was the head of a thriving architecture firm. I built modern homes, had a loving family, and enjoyed a reputation that took me 20 years to build. I was a devoted church member as well. Every Sunday I sat in the front row, nodded along with the sermon, and gave generously to every charity project. I thought my wealth and success were proof of God's blessing on my life. I believed I had an unspoken agreement with heaven. As long as I worked hard and acted as a good Christian, my life would remain safe, peaceful, and prosperous. But I was wrong. The foundation I had built was made of sand. It all started with a single phone call on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A major commercial project I had invested everything into went completely bankrupt. Overnight, the investors backed out, leaving me legally and financially responsible for millions of dollars in unpaid debt. Within 8 short months, everything I owned was stripped away. My company was liquidated, my bank accounts were frozen, and our family home was put up for public auction. The relentless stress and constant fear acted like poison inside my home. My wife, unable to bear the anxiety and shame of our sudden downfall, took our young daughter and moved back to her parents' home in another country. I did not even have the strength to ask her to stay. I could not even buy groceries for them anymore. By the winter of that year, I found myself sleeping in the back seat of a battered 20-year-old truck parked in a dark, abandoned industrial alleyway on the edge of the town. Have you ever felt a cold so deep that it seeps straight into your bones? It is not the kind of cold you can escape with a jacket. It is a suffocating, freezing weight that makes your fingers so stiff you cannot even open a bottle of water. I used to sit in that freezing truck, counting the few coins left in my cup holder. $2, $1.50. Just enough for a warm cup of tea at a local gas station, so I could stand near their heater for 10 minutes before being asked to leave. And that was when the deep anger and bitterness took over my heart. I remember staring up through the cracked windshield at the pitch-black night sky. The rain turned into a heavy, relentless snowstorm. I screamed into the empty truck until my throat burned. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel until my hands went completely numb. "Where are you, God?" I sobbed into the cold air. "I served you. I gave my money to your church. I tried to live a righteous life. Why did you let them destroy me? Why have you abandoned me in this dark tunnel?" There was no answer, only the sound of the howling wind outside. That silence felt like a death sentence. I was convinced that God was either completely fake or that He actively hated me. I was 50 years old, starving, freezing, and utterly erased from the world. On a freezing night in mid-December, the temperature plummeted far below freezing. My truck battery had died 3 days earlier, meaning there was no heater, no light, and no way out. My toes had gone completely numb, and a strange, heavy drowsiness began to wash over my mind. I pulled a thin, damp blanket over my head and made a quiet decision. I stopped fighting. I closed my eyes, ready to let the freezing cold take my life away. I thought that was the absolute end of my story, but what I did not know in that dark tunnel was that the end of my own strength was the exact place where His story was about to begin. When you give up on living, death no longer feels terrifying. It feels like the only quiet place left in the world that has been screaming at you for years. That night in the back of my frozen truck, I stopped praying. I stopped crying. My mind drifted into a completely dark, silent void. Then a sharp, sudden metallic sound rattled against the driver's side window. I did not move. I thought my freezing mind was playing tricks on me in my final moments. The sound came again, louder and more insistent. 3 heavy knocks against the frozen glass. Slowly, with effort that felt like lifting heavy weights, I pulled the damp blanket away from my face. Standing outside in the middle of the blinding blizzard was an elderly man holding an old yellow flashlight. I forced my stiff fingers to roll the window down an inch. The freezing wind immediately blasted into the cab, stinging my skin. "Are you alive in there?" a calm, deep voice called out. The man was wearing a worn canvas coat and a knitted hat covered in snow. His eyes behind his round glasses were remarkably kind. I could barely speak. My jaw was locked tight from the shivering cold. "I am fine," I managed to whisper, my voice dry and weak. "Just resting." The old man shook his head, looking at the frost covering the inside of my windshield. "Son," he said firmly, "if you stay in this vehicle tonight, you will not wake up tomorrow. My name is Samuel. My church is just down the block, and the basement heater is running. Come with me right now." Pride is a terrible thing. Even when you are freezing to death in a dark alley, a toxic voice inside you whispers that you do not need anyone's pity. I wanted to tell him to go away and leave me alone to die. But Samuel did not wait for my pride to answer. He opened the frozen truck door, reached in with a surprisingly strong grip, and took me by the arm. He pulled my weak body out of the seat. The moment my feet touched the ice, my knees buckled, but Samuel caught me before I hit the ground. He draped my heavy arm over his shoulder and guided me through the snowstorm. We shuffled slowly through the deep snow for 2 blocks. Every breath felt like sharp glass entering my lungs. We arrived at a small, old brick building with a plain wooden cross, illuminated by a single warm light above the entrance. It was a modest chapel I had driven past hundreds of times in my former life without ever noticing. Samuel unlocked a side door and led me down into a warm basement room. The air smelled of wood, old books, and hot coffee. To my frozen body, that warm air felt like life rushing back into my dying veins. He sat me down on an old green sofa near a roaring radiator and wrapped a thick, dry wool blanket around my shivering shoulders. He did not ask for my name. He did not ask how an adult man ended up freezing in a truck. He simply walked over to a small counter, poured a bowl of hot vegetable soup and a cup of black coffee, and set them on the table before me. "Eat first," Samuel said softly, taking a seat in a wooden chair across from me. "We can talk tomorrow, or we never have to talk at all. You are safe here tonight." As I held the warm mug between my trembling hands, hot tears began to spill over my eyelids, falling onto my frozen coat. I had not felt human in over 2 years. I had been hunted by debt collectors, shunned by former friends, and ignored by every passerby. Yet here was a complete stranger, giving me heat, shelter, and food, without asking for anything in return. "Why are you doing this for me?" I choked out between mouthfuls of hot soup. "Why do you care about a ruined, useless man?" Samuel looked at me with a calm, profound grace that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Because 10 years ago," Samuel replied softly, "I was sitting in that exact same alleyway, in a rusted car, waiting for the cold to take me. And an old pastor walked down those steps and pulled me inside." Hearing Samuel say those words felt like a sudden wave of warmth breaking through my frozen heart. I stared at him, unable to fathom how this quiet, dignified man with gentle eyes had once been stranded in the same freezing alleyway, waiting for his life to end. "How did you survive?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper in the silent basement. "How do you ever begin to rebuild when everything you were has been completely turned to ash?" Samuel offered a warm, understanding smile, a smile born of real pain rather than empty words. "You do not rebuild your old life, Ethan," he said softly. "God does not patch up the old house that collapsed. He builds an entirely new foundation. But to see it, you first have to stop trying to gather the broken pieces of your past." That night, for the first time in over 2 years, I slept on a clean, soft bed in the church's small basement room. There was no sound of wind tearing through a rusty truck, no fear of being chased away by police, and no freezing drafts penetrating my clothes. Yet, when I woke up the following morning, the physical comfort could not quiet the storm raging inside my mind. When your wealth, status, and family are taken away, you realize how much of your worth was tied to things that can vanish in a single hour. Looking at my reflection in the small bathroom mirror, seeing my sunken cheeks and messy grey hair, I felt completely hollow. I walked upstairs into the main chapel. The early morning sunlight was streaming through simple stained glass windows, casting soft beams of blue and amber light across the quiet wooden pews. At the front of the altar stood a plain wooden pulpit, and behind it, a large wooden cross mounted on the wall. I walked slowly down the centre aisle, my worn boots making a quiet sound against the floorboards. I stood before the cross, my heart heavy with a profound, lingering grief. "I thought I knew you," I whispered into the quiet room. "I prayed every week. I donated my money to your houses. I tried to live an honest life. Why did you let my world crumble into pieces? What did I do to deserve this dark tunnel?" I waited for an answer, expecting a grand voice or a sudden miracle to clear my doubts. But the chapel remained entirely silent. Then my eyes drifted toward an open Bible resting on the wooden podium. A gentle draught from a side window ruffled the pages, coming to rest near the middle of the scriptures. I stepped up to the podium and looked down at the open page. My eyes landed on the Psalm 34, verse 18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." I read the words once, then I read them again, letting every syllable sink deep into my wounded soul. All my life, I believed that God was closest to me when my architecture firm was winning awards and my bank accounts were overflowing. I thought his favour was measured by comfort, luxury, and success. But those words turned my entire belief system upside down. God was not promising to be closest to the powerful or the prosperous. He was promising to be right beside the broken-hearted and the crushed. It hit me with overwhelming clarity. God had not abandoned me in that dark, freezing alleyway. He had not turned his back when my business failed or my family left. In fact, he was closer to me in that frozen truck than he had ever been when I was sitting arrogantly in the front row of my old church. I fell to my knees right there on the hard wooden floor before the altar. I buried my face in my hands and wept uncontrollably. They were not tears of anger, but tears of absolute surrender. "Lord," I prayed, "I have nothing left to offer you. No money, no pride, no strength, and no future of my own making. I am completely crushed. Take my broken pieces and do whatever you want with my life. I stopped running today." Surrendering your life to God does not mean your earthly troubles vanish like magic the very next morning. When I woke up the next day, I was still a 50-year-old man with no money, no home, no job, and a massive trail of financial debt behind my name. The harsh reality of the world was still waiting outside the chapel doors. However, something fundamental deep within my spirit had shifted forever. The suffocating weight that had been crushing my chest for years was finally lifted away. I no longer had to pretend to be strong. I no longer had to carry the impossible burden of trying to rebuild my life using my own fragile strength. Samuel did not offer me a free ride or a life of idleness. He offered me something far more valuable, a chance to serve with my hands. The small church needed someone to maintain the building, sweep the halls, shovel snow from the steps, and keep the old coal heater running through the harsh winter months. In exchange, Samuel provided me with a warm room, 3 simple meals a day, and $25 a week. To the man I used to be, $25 would not have covered a quick coffee meeting with a client. But to the man I was becoming, those $25 felt like pure grace. It was honest money, earned with sweat, and given with unconditional love. Every morning at 5 o'clock, long before the sun began to rise, I walked through the quiet chapel. I shoveled heavy snow off the front walkway, listening to the crisp sound of my shovel against the stone. I mopped the floors, dusted the pews, and ensured the sanctuary was warm for the morning prayer warriors. For the first time in my entire life, I was doing work that brought me no public praise, no media recognition, and no financial wealth. Yet, as I wiped down those wooden pews one by one, I discovered a quiet, unbreakable peace that my millions of dollars had never been able to buy. I began praying for the people who would sit in those seats every Sunday. I prayed for the weary parents, the unemployed fathers, the sick elderly members, and the lonely teenagers. My mind slowly turned away from my own grief and began to focus on comforting others. One afternoon in late January, while cleaning out an old storage cabinet behind the chapel kitchen, I discovered a small set of woodworking tools and several discarded blocks of oak wood. Before my life crumbled, woodworking had been a minor hobby of mine, something I enjoyed doing in my garage on quiet weekends. I had not touched a piece of wood in over 6 years. I sat down at the wooden workbench in the basement, picked up a small carving chisel, and held a block of oak in my hands. The familiar scent of fresh wood brought back a wave of quiet memories. With slow, deliberate care, I began to shape the wood. I had no grand plan. I simply wanted to create something beautiful out of a piece of timber that had been forgotten in a dusty closet. I spent 4 evenings carving a small wooden cross. I smoothed the edges, carved subtle leaf patterns along the sides, and polished it until the grain shone brightly in the warm basement light. When it was finished, I handed it to Samuel as a small gift to express my gratitude for saving my life. Samuel held the carved cross in his hands, turning it under the lamplight. "Ethan," he said, looking up at me with deep astonishment, "this is extraordinary work. The detail and precision are incredible." I gave a faint, humble smile. "Just a small hobby from a past life," I replied softly. Samuel looked at the cross for a long time, then looked straight into my eyes with a gentle firmness. "God never wastes a single detail of your life, Ethan," he said. "Not even the gifts and talents you thought were buried in the rubble of your past. We often assume that redemption comes in a dramatic, lightning-fast moment. We wait for a sudden financial windfall, an unexpected phone call, or an overnight miracle that fixes everything in an instant. But in my journey, I learned that God usually works through quiet seeds planted in humble soil. That simple oak cross was one of those seeds. A few days after I gave the cross to Samuel, a local school teacher named Rebecca came down to the chapel basement to organize clothing donations. She saw the wooden cross sitting on Samuel's desk and picked it up with great care. "Who created this?" she asked, running her thumb over the smooth wood. "The craftsmanship and detail are truly remarkable." Samuel pointed toward the corner where I was repairing a broken door hinge. "Ethan carved that," he answered with a proud smile. Rebecca walked over to me, holding the cross. "My elderly mother is turning 80 next month," she said gently. "She has been bedridden with illness for 2 years and spends her days holding a small plastic rosary. I would love to give her a hand-carved wooden cross just like this. Could I commission you to make one for her? I can pay you $40. $40. It was more money than I earned in an entire week of janitorial work. I looked at her kind face and hesitated. "I do not have proper carving tools or fine wood," I admitted honestly. "I only have what was left in the storage closet." Rebecca smiled warm-heartedness and pulled a crisp $50 bill from her coat pocket. "Use this to buy whatever supplies you need," she said firmly. "Consider it an investment in your work." That afternoon, I took the bus to a local woodworking supply store. Holding that $50 bill in my hand felt utterly surreal. For years, I had felt like a useless burden to society. Now, someone was trusting me to create something meaningful for their family. I spent 4 days carefully selecting the wood, carving intricate patterns, and sanding the cross until it felt smooth as silk. Every stroke of the chisel was done with deep prayer and quiet gratitude. When I delivered the finished cross to Rebecca the following Sunday, her eyes welled up with tears. She held it close to her heart, as if it were a priceless treasure. "This is not just wood, Ethan," she whispered. "This carries the very peace of God." Word began to spread quietly through the small chapel community. A week later, another member asked me to carve a wooden plaque for his newborn grandson. Then a local pastor asked if I could design a new wooden communion tray for his sanctuary. Working in that basement room every evening after finishing my maintenance duties, I felt a deep, holy purpose flowing back into my soul. My hands, which had been frozen and lifeless in that cold truck, were now bringing joy, comfort, and beauty to hurting people. I was not becoming rich. I was earning just enough to purchase basic supplies, save a few dollars in an envelope, and buy warm clothes. Yet, the greatest miracle was not happening in my pocketbook. It was happening deep within my heart. When you lose everything you once relied on, you realize that your true identity was never tied to your job title, your house, or your social status. Your true worth comes from being a child of God, called to love and serve others right where you stand. I was no longer Ethan the bankrupt architect. I was Ethan, a man saved by unconditional grace, shaping wood and restoring faith in a quiet basement. And for the very first time in my life, that was more than enough. While my hands were busy crafting and my days were filled with honest work, there was still a deep, aching wound in my soul that no amount of wood carving could ever heal. My family. For 3 long years, I had not spoken a single word to my wife Sarah or my daughter Grace. When my life collapsed, the shame was so heavy that I completely withdrew into the shadows. I was convinced that I was a failure who had ruined their lives, and that they would be far better off if they forgot I ever existed. Every night before I turned off the light in my small basement room, I took out a worn photograph from my jacket pocket. It showed Sarah laughing under a blooming cherry blossom tree, holding 4-year-old Grace in her arms. The edges of the photo were soft and frayed from years of my trembling fingers holding it in the dark. Guilt is a heavy burden to carry alone. I spent countless sleepless nights wondering if Sarah hated me, or if little Grace even remembered her father's face. One rainy Sunday evening in March, after the congregation had left, Samuel walked into the basement and sat down beside me at the workbench. "Ethan," he said quietly, looking at the faded photograph resting near my carving tools, "you have allowed God to heal your spirit, and you have allowed him to restore your hands. But you are still holding on to a prison of shame when it comes to your family." I looked down at the workbench, my throat tightening. "I failed them, Samuel," I whispered, tears filling my eyes. "I lost our home. I could not protect them. I ran away like a coward because I could not bear their disappointment." Samuel placed his hand firmly on my shoulder. "Shame tells you to hide in the dark forever, Ethan," he said with deep authority. "But grace calls you to step into the light and seek forgiveness. You cannot change the past, but you can offer them a humble heart today." That night, I sat down at the small desk with a sheet of paper and a pen. My hands shook so violently that I could barely write the first sentence. I did not write a letter making excuses for my failure. I did not blame the bad economy or the partner who betrayed me. I simply poured out my heart in pure, unvarnished honesty. I wrote to Sarah, asking for her forgiveness for running away when she needed me most. I told her that I was safe, that I was working, and that God had pulled me out of the deepest, dark tunnel of my life. I told her that I did not expect her to take me back, nor did I demand anything from her. But I wanted her to know that I loved her and Grace with every beat of my heart. I enclosed the little oak cross I had carved, along with a small envelope containing $300, every single penny I had managed to save from my carving work. I walked to the corner postbox at midnight, the rain pouring down on my coat. I stood before the iron box for 20 minutes, holding the letter against my chest, praying that God would guide it into her hands. With a trembling breath, I dropped the letter into the slot and heard it fall to the bottom. I had no idea if she would read it, tear it up, or throw it straight into the trash. But as I walked back to the chapel through the rain, I felt a strange, quiet freedom in my soul. I had finally surrendered my greatest shame into the hands of God. Waiting is often the hardest part of any spiritual journey. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into a month. Every time the mail carrier walked past the chapel gates, my heart would leap into my throat, only to sink back down into quiet acceptance when no letter arrived for me. I continued my daily routines, sweeping the halls, carving wooden pieces for local families, and attending the quiet morning prayer meetings. I learned to trust that whatever happened, God was still holding my life securely in his hands. On a bright afternoon in mid-April, while I was outside repairing a wooden fence near the chapel entrance, a small silver car pulled up to the curb. The car door opened, and a woman stepped out into the sunlight. She was wearing a beige trench coat, her hair tied back neatly. My heart stopped beating for a second. The hammer slipped from my hand and fell onto the grass. It was Sarah. She stood by the car, looking across the lawn at me. She looked older, with subtle lines of care around her eyes, but to me she was just as beautiful as the day I first met her. Beside her stepped out a young girl, wearing a yellow dress, holding a familiar small wooden cross tightly in her hand. Grace. She was now 7 years old, no longer the toddler I had left behind. I stood frozen in the middle of the lawn, completely overcome with emotion. I was wearing my worn work pants and a faded shirt covered in wood dust. Sarah walked slowly across the grass, stopping a few feet away from me. For a long, intense moment, neither of us said a word. The air between us was filled with the heavy weight of 3 years of silence, pain, and tears. I looked down at her face, my eyes filling with hot tears. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice breaking, "I am so sorry." Sarah looked at my dusty clothes, my hands calloused from hard labour, and the deep humility evident in my eyes. She did not vent anger. Instead, tears began to flow down her cheeks. "We received your letter, Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "We received the cross you carved for Grace." I looked at little Grace, who was peeking out from behind her mother's coat, staring at me with wide, curious eyes. "Is he my daddy?" Grace asked softly, looking up at Sarah. Sarah nodded through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "This is your daddy." I dropped to my knees right there on the grass. Grace hesitated for a second, then stepped forward and held out the small carved cross toward me. "You made this for me, right?" she asked quietly. I nodded, wiping my tears with the back of my sleeve. "Yes, Grace, I carved every single line for you." She stepped closer and wrapped her small arms around my neck. I buried my face in her shoulder, holding my daughter for the first time in 3 long years, weeping with a gratitude that no words on earth could ever describe. Sarah knelt down beside us and placed her hand gently over mine. "We have a long road ahead of us, Ethan," she said softly. "There are many wounds that need time to heal. But seeing you here, humble and alive, I know that God has done something truly miraculous in your heart." That afternoon, in the quiet garden of the church that had saved my life, my broken family took its very first step toward total restoration. Restoration is rarely an instantaneous event. It is a slow, beautiful process of rebuilding trust, piece by piece, brick by brick. Over the next 6 months, Sarah, Grace and I spent hours talking, praying and laying bare all the fears and pain that had torn us apart years before. I did not move back into a comfortable home immediately. I stayed in my small room at the chapel, continuing my janitorial work and refining my woodworking craft, while Sarah and Grace lived in a small rented apartment nearby. Every evening after my work was finished, I walked over to their apartment to help Grace with her homework, cook dinner, and read her bedtime stories. Without the pressure of maintaining a lavish lifestyle, I discovered the beauty of simplicity. We did not have expensive vacations or luxury cars, but we had warm meals, genuine laughter, and a deep, unshakable faith that anchored our home. During this time, something unexpected began to happen with my woodworking. The small orders for carved crosses and communion trays began to multiply rapidly. People from neighbouring towns were hearing about the craftsmen living at the chapel, who carved scripture verses into discarded wood. One morning, a local business owner named Marcus, who ran a large community centre in the city, visited the chapel basement. He walked around my small workshop, looking at the carved wooden plaques and decorative panels lining the walls. "Ethan," Marcus said, running his hand over a large oak panel I had carved with the words of Isaiah 40, verse 31. "I am building a new shelter for homeless families downtown. I want the main entrance hall to feel warm, welcoming, and filled with hope. I would like you to design and craft all the interior wooden panelling and doors for the building." I looked at him in total shock. "That is a massive project," I said, my heart beating fast. "It would take months of full-time work." Marcus smiled and handed me an official contract. "I know your work, Ethan," he said firmly. "I know where you came from, and I know the heart you put into every piece of wood you touch. We are willing to pay you a full commercial salary for this project." Holding that contract in my hands, I realized that God was not just restoring my finances. He was integrating my past architectural skills with my newfound humble trade, turning my broken history into a source of blessing for others who were lost and hurting. With Samuel's blessing, I converted an old, unused barn on the chapel property into a full woodworking workshop. I hired 2 young men from a local rehabilitation centre to assist me, teaching them the art of wood, carving and sharing with them the story of how God had pulled me out of my own dark tunnel. My past, which I had once viewed as a shameful waste of years, had become the very testimony that gave hope to young men who were freezing in their own emotional coldness. God had taken the broken pieces of my life, recycled them in the quiet dark of that chapel basement, and was now using them to build something stronger and far more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. 3 years after the day markers handed me that contract, my woodworking studio had grown into a thriving social enterprise. We were not just creating custom furniture and sacred architectural elements for churches across the country. We were hiring men who had lost everything. Men who were living in their cars, coming out of prison, or struggling with deep despair. We taught them a craft, paid them a fair living wage, and showed them that their lives were far from over in the eyes of God. My family was completely whole once again. Sarah and I bought a modest, light-filled home near the chapel, surrounded by trees and a small garden where Grace played every afternoon. The financial debt that had once threatened to drown me was completely settled through years of honest, steady labour. Yet, despite all the blessings and success, I never allowed my heart to forget where I came from. Every Tuesday evening, no matter how busy my schedule was, I drove down to the same industrial alleyway, where I had once laid freezing in the back of my old truck. I brought hot soup, thick wool blankets, and flashlights. I walked through the snow and rain, knocking gently on the windows of rusted cars and cold vans, looking for lost men who were waiting for the cold to take them away. I would roll down my window, hand them a warm cup of soup, and look straight into their tired, desperate eyes. "My name is Ethan," I would tell them softly. 10 years ago, I was sitting in that exact same spot, freezing to death, believing that God had forgotten me completely. But He pulled me out, and He wants to pull you out tonight. I saw the same disbelief in their eyes that I had once shown to Samuel. I saw the shame, the pride, and the deep, silent agony of feeling completely invisible to the world. And one by one, over the years, we brought dozens of men out of those dark alleyways and into the warm basement of our chapel workshop. We watched their frozen bodies thaw, their broken spirits heal, and their faith become restored from the ashes. Looking back over the long, winding road of my life, I finally understood the deeper mystery of suffering. God never allowed me to go through that dark tunnel to destroy me. He allowed my worldly pride and false security to crumble, so that I could encounter His true love and grace. He stripped away my temporary riches so that He could give me eternal purpose. If I had never lost my business, I would have remained an arrogant, self-righteous man who relied entirely on his own strength. If I had never slept in that freezing truck, I would have never known the profound mercy of a stranger who cared enough to knock on my window. My darkest hour was not the end of my life. It was the sacred birthplace of my true destiny. Today, when I stand at the back of our chapel during Sunday service, looking at my beautiful wife, my growing daughter, and the dozens of restored men worshipping alongside us, my heart overflows with quiet praise. The world measures a man by how high he climbs, how much wealth he accumulates, and how powerful his name becomes. But heaven measures a man by how low he is willing to stoop to lift up someone who has fallen into the dark. Perhaps you are listening to this story today because you are walking through your own dark tunnel right now. Perhaps you are sitting in a quiet room staring at unpaid bills, nursing a broken heart, or lying awake in the middle of the night, wondering why your world has completely collapsed around you. You might feel like you are standing in the absolute dark, unable to see where up is anymore. You might believe that your mistakes have ruined your future, or that God has turned His back on you forever. I want to look you in the eyes and tell you with absolute certainty, that is a lie. God has not forgotten you today. He sees every tear you have cried in secret. He hears every quiet groan of your heart when you are too tired to pray. He knows the exact depth of the cold that is seeping into your bones right now. Your current storm is not a sign that your life is over. It is the exact place where His unshakable grace is about to begin. Stop trying to gather the broken pieces of your past with your own exhausted hands. Stop trying to fight the darkness using your fragile strength. Open your heart, bow your knees, and surrender your life completely into the loving hands of the Saviour who died to set you free. He is knocking on the window of your heart today, holding out a lantern of hope in the middle of your blizzard. All you have to do is reach out your hand and step into the warm light of His presence. No matter how far you have fallen, no matter how deep your dark tunnel may seem, His grace is deeper still. Your story is far from over. In fact, your greatest chapter is just about to be written. Let Him pull you out of the cold today. Let Him restore your broken faith, and watch Him turn your deepest dark season into a beautiful light that will guide many others back home.